Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into a dark and unsettling reality: life on death row. Some prisoners don't just spend years waiting for their sentence to be carried out. They spend decades trapped in a cycle of appeals, delays, and isolation, never knowing when their final day will come. In this video, we'll explore the cases of those who spent the longest time on death row before their execution. We'll take a look at their crimes, their sentencing, and the reasons why their fate was postponed for so long. Some of these cases are filled with controversy, legal battles, and even questions of innocence. Others are simply a reflection of a system that moves at a painfully slow pace, leaving inmates in a limbo between life and death for decades. For many, the wait itself becomes a punishment beyond the death sentence. Years of confinement in a small cell, with little to no human interaction, can break even the most hardened individuals. Some accept their fate, while others fight until their very last breath, hoping for a last-minute miracle. Due to the disturbing nature of these cases, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Now let's get into it. Thomas Eugene Creech was sentenced to death in 1981 for the brutal murder of a fellow inmate inside the Idaho State Penitentiary. At the time, he was already a convicted serial killer, linked to at least 5 other murders across multiple states. Authorities believe his true number of victims could be even higher. Creech had a long history of violent crime, beginning in the early 1970s, and had been incarcerated for multiple offenses before landing on death row. His 1981 death sentence came after he beat his cellmate, David Jensen, to death using a sock filled with batteries. Jensen, a disabled inmate, had no way to defend himself against Creech's attack. Prosecutors argued that this was a cold, calculated killing, and he was swiftly sentenced to death. Despite receiving a death sentence over 4 decades ago, Creech remains alive today, making him one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the United States. His execution has been repeatedly delayed due to legal challenges, appeals, and complications surrounding Idaho's execution protocols. Over the years, his legal team has fought to overturn his sentence, citing concerns over his mental health and the state's execution methods. In February 2024, his scheduled execution was abruptly canceled when prison officials failed to establish a viable IV line for the lethal injection. This incident raised further questions about the state's ability to carry out executions humanely and effectively. As a result, his death sentence was once again postponed indefinitely. Creech's case is a prime example of the complexities of the American justice system. While some argue that he deserves to face his long-awaited execution, others believe that decades of solitary confinement and uncertainty have already served as an extreme form of punishment. His story is a chilling reminder of the slow-moving nature of capital punishment and the legal battles that can keep a convicted killer alive for decades. Raymond Riles and his accomplice, Herbert Washington, visited a used car lot in Houston in 1974 with the intention of purchasing a vehicle. After a dispute over the price, Riles fatally shot the salesman, John Thomas Henry. Both men were arrested and charged with capital murder. While Washington had his death sentence overturned and was released in 1983, Riles was sentenced to death in 1976. Riles spent over 45 years on Texas's death row, making him the longest-serving death row inmate in the United States. During this time, his execution was postponed multiple times due to his history of severe mental illness, including schizophrenia and psychosis. In 1986, his execution was halted due to concerns about his mental competency. Over the years, he was treated with antipsychotic medication, but he was never deemed mentally fit for execution. In April 2021, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that his death sentence could not stand, as the original jury had not properly considered his history of mental illness. Finally, in June 2021, Riles was resentenced to life in prison, making him eligible for parole. However, authorities have stated that they will fight any attempts to release him. Riles's prolonged stay on death row was due to the complexity of his case, his severe mental illness, and the ongoing legal appeals that challenged the fairness of executing someone in his condition. Richard Gerald Jordan was 29 years old when he committed a calculated crime in Gulfport, Mississippi, in January 1976. He traveled from Louisiana to Mississippi with a plan in mind. First, he called Gulf National Bank, pretending to be a potential client, and asked to speak with a loan officer. Once he was connected to Charles Martyr, he ended the call, looked up Martyr's home address in a phone directory, and went to the residence, posing as an electric company worker. After gaining entry into the home, Jordan kidnapped Martyr's wife, Edwina, and took her to a secluded wooded area. There, instead of following through with any ransom plan, he shot her to death. Later, he contacted Charles Martyr, lying that his wife was still alive, and demanded a $25,000 ransom. The investigation quickly led to Jordan's arrest, and he was charged with capital murder. Jordan was sentenced to death in 1976, and he has spent over 48 years on Mississippi's death row, making him the longest-serving death row inmate in the state. His execution has been delayed numerous times due to a series of legal appeals and procedural challenges. In December 2022, Jordan filed an appeal claiming he had been denied due process. He argued that he should have been granted a psychiatric expert who worked solely for his defense rather than a court-appointed examiner who reported to both the prosecution and the defense. However, in October 2024, the Mississippi Supreme Court rejected his appeal, stating that this issue had already been addressed in previous legal proceedings and that the use of a single court-appointed expert did not violate his constitutional rights. Following the ruling, Attorney General Lynn Fitch requested that an execution date be set, arguing that Jordan had exhausted all of his legal options at both the state and federal levels. Despite the decades of legal battles, Jordan's case remains a prime example of the complexities surrounding the death penalty and the prolonged nature of capital punishment litigation in the United States. Kerry Dean Moore was 21 years old when he committed 2 brutal murders in Omaha, Nebraska in August 1979. His crimes targeted cab drivers, whom he lured to isolated locations before shooting them. On August 22, 1979, Moore called for a cab and was picked up by 47-year-old Reuel Van Ness Jr. Once they reached a secluded area, Moore pulled out a gun and fatally shot Van Ness. Just a few days later, on August 27th, he repeated the crime, this time killing 48-year-old cab driver Maynard Helgeland. Both murders were carried out during robbery attempts, and the victims were shot multiple times. Moore was arrested shortly after the second murder and quickly confessed to both crimes. He was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1980. However, what followed was one of the longest waits for execution in Nebraska's history. Moore spent 38 years on Nebraska's death row, with his execution being delayed numerous times due to legal appeals, changes in state laws, and challenges over execution protocols. In 1991, a federal appellate court overturned his death sentence, leading to a resentencing where he was again condemned to death. More legal battles followed, with debates over Nebraska's execution methods prolonging the process. Despite the delays, Moore eventually stopped fighting his sentence and requested that his execution be carried out. On August 14, 2018, at the age of 60, he was executed by lethal injection. Douglas Ray Stankiewicz was 19 years old when he was involved in the abduction and murder of 22-year-old Teresa Graybeal in Fresno, California, in February 1978. Stankiewicz and a group of acquaintances kidnapped Graybeal from a shopping center parking lot, allegedly intending to steal her car. They drove her to an isolated location, where Stankiewicz was accused of fatally shooting her execution style. Shortly after the murder, Stankiewicz was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Despite maintaining his innocence and arguing that his legal representation was inadequate, he was convicted and sentenced to death later that same year. Stankiewicz has now spent over 47 years on California's death row, making him one of the state's longest-serving death row inmates. His case has gone through multiple appeals and legal battles, with his defense team consistently arguing that he was not the actual shooter. Additionally, concerns have been raised about the fairness of his trial, as he came from a background of severe childhood abuse, neglect, and mental health struggles. Despite decades of appeals, Stankowicz's conviction and death sentence have been upheld multiple times. However, California has not carried out an execution since 2006, and in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom placed a moratorium on the death penalty, effectively halting all executions in the state. This has left Stankowicz in a state of legal limbo, neither exonerated nor executed, spending nearly 5 decades in solitary confinement. His case exemplifies the complex and often drawn-out process of capital punishment in the U.S., particularly in states like California, where legal delays, appeals, and political decisions have created one of the largest death row populations in the country. Leroy Nash was 66 years old when he committed the crime that led to his final incarceration. Nash had a long history of criminal activity and had previously served time for murder. In 1977, while serving a life sentence in Utah, he escaped from a prison work crew and made his way to Arizona. On November 3, 1982, Nash entered a coin shop in Phoenix, intending to commit robbery. During the crime, he fatally shot the store employee, Greg West, and fled with stolen goods. He was quickly apprehended and charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery. In 1983, Nash was convicted and sentenced to death. His time on death row was marked by numerous legal appeals and ongoing debates about his mental competency. Over the years, his health declined significantly. He suffered from dementia and multiple physical ailments. These health issues delayed his execution as legal battles continued over whether he was fit for capital punishment. Nash remained on Arizona's death row for over 26 years. At the time of his death from natural causes on February 12, 2010, at the age of 94, he was one of the oldest death row inmates in the United States. His case raised ethical concerns about the prolonged incarceration of aging inmates awaiting execution and whether executing someone in such a condition constituted justice. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoy this kind of content, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss any future videos. See you in the next one.